Chapter 2. A short walk and an elevator ride later, we were entering that center of control that I always loved to visit. As the doors slid open, I stepped into the spacious open room with windows spanning 3 walls along the 4 sides. The colors, a pleasing mellow blue and gray, harmonized with the deep green jackets of the 3 primary officers who had remained at their stations. The data controller and the comm marshal sat at their panels while the science exec had the captain's chair. He arose as we entered and faced his captain. Mr. Yannendale marshaled the message, sir. Identification? The captain asked, settling himself in his accustomed seat. None yet, sir. We notified you first. Gilders headed for the helm, and I slid into the navigator's position just in front and to the right of the captain's chair. It had been a while since I'd filled in here. Request identification, the captain ordered. Yes, sir. Mr. Yannendale spoke into his headset. This is Surveyor. Please identify. I looked over my shoulder and watched his face. A broad grin spread over it, and he took off the headset and said, On speakers, Captain. What? A voice I knew better than I knew my own came over the speakers. Repeat, this is Alacrity 1, requesting permission to lock on. I couldn't resist a squeal of delight. The Alacrity 1 hadn't been around for almost a year. The captain pressed the intercom button on his chair. You're free to come and go as you please, as I'm sure you know, sir. I thought as much, the voice returned. Approaching. Don't tell Uncle. I want to surprise him. The captain looked at me and I nodded. Copy that, Alacrity 1. He switched off his intercom and began to give orders. Propulsion to 0, Mr. Gilders. Aye, sir. Mr. Ralston, stand by to lock off life support systems in port airlock 1. Life support system standing by. The captain spoke into his wristcom. Commander Howitt, send a mate to operate moorings at port peripheral access 1. Aye, sir, came a gravelly voice from the comm. Engage port 1, Mr. Ralston. Port airlock 1 engaged, sir. Alacrity 1 is clear to moor, port 1, the captain directed. Mr. Yannendale nodded and relayed the message. Track Alacrity 1 on scopes, Mr. Wales. Yes, sir. I smiled at Gilders. So are you two going to have it out this time? His bushy eyebrows didn't move as he answered pragmatically, If he doesn't challenge me, I won't challenge him. And if he does? Instead of answering, he turned his attention to the approaching speeder, which had just switched from warp speed to propulsion and now did a daring 360-degree flip as it approached. I smiled in pure delight, and the captain shook his head. The devil. He knows we're watching him. Finally, after a few more little showy maneuvers, the speeder zoomed past the port window, and a moment later the voice came again over the speakers. The Eagle has crashed. Copy that, Alacrity 1. I laughed and stood up, straightening my jacket and trying to straighten my face as I turned towards the captain. Request permission to welcome guest aboard, sir. Shaking his head at me with an exaggerated sigh, the captain said, Permission granted, in an amused tone. Then to Mr. Ralston, seal and disengage airlock. Gilders, tie navigation into the helm until Andy gets back. Aye, Captain. Gesturing towards the door, the captain smiled at me. That was the only encouragement I needed to rush off the bridge and into the elevator. See deck, I indicated, and was moved downwards. From the elevator, I hurried down the corridor until I reached the entrance to port airlock 1. It was still closed, and I leaned forward as I waited for it to slide open. When it did, I beheld 32-year-old dark-haired, grinning Eagle crash with his arms crossed over his chest in a jaunty attitude. His dark leather jacket and deep red pants and shirt only added to the impression he immediately gave anyone who saw him. Adventurer. Greetings, cousin, were his first words as he stepped from the chamber. I rushed to embrace him. Crash, so good to see you again. He good-naturedly put his arm around my shoulders. Didn't tell Uncle, did you? No, I was on the bridge when you arrived. I heard you. Oh, then you saw my little stunts? You know I did, I laughed. How do you want to break the news to the doctor? Come, Andy, don't talk about it as if we were going to a funeral. Don't you think my dear uncle will be thrilled to see me? He offered me his arm. Laughing, I took it, and we started toward sickbay. Thrilled may be a slight overstatement. I lowered my voice. but he will be glad to see you, even if he doesn't show it."
"Oh, don't worry. I've known the old fellow longer than you have. I know his ups and downs like nobody else. But tell me how things have been around the old surveyor."
I began to relate our adventures since he'd last visited. Crash, nobody ever called him Eagle, was like the older brother I'd always wished for. Though I had only been 4, I remembered when the doctor sat me down and told me that his younger sister had died, his sister whom I had never met but had heard of many times. He'd told me about my cousin, Eagle, who was 18 years old and would be staying with us while he continued his training as a space pilot. 4 years Crash had stayed with us, and 4 years didn't seem long at all with him around. Despite the difference in our ages and the fact that I wasn't even related to him, he took an immediate interest in me and involved me in many of his adventures. Some were good memories, like the time he snuck me into one of his pilot academy classes when I was 7 and let me fly the simulator. Others were not so good, like when the doctor had caught us draining the locks out of the rocket base fuel tanks. And then there were some that involved a mixture of feelings, like the time he had taken the doctor and I on our first space flight. I had loved it, but the doctor, to say the least, had not, and had made it thoroughly clear that he would never again enter a craft that Crash piloted if his life depended on it. In spite of all this, I'd seen the wistfulness behind the doctor's eyes lately whenever we spoke of his nephew. Even a hint of worry. It had been so long since we'd heard from him. But now he was here, and all was well. I couldn't wait to see the look on the doctor's face when his eyes fell on the sturdy form beside me. I talked on as we hurried in and out of the elevator and down the halls, and we came in sight of the last bend before sickbay so quickly that I didn't have time to ask him what he'd been up to. Pulling me against the wall, he whispered, "Go on in and talk to him." "What do you want me to say?" I giggled. "Anything that doesn't have to do with me. I'll take care of the rest. Now scoot." Pushing me out, he winked and slipped back into his corner. I straightened my jacket, cleared my throat, and walked toward sickbay. "Doctor?" He came out of the room, rubbing a glob of sanitizer between his hands. "What is it, Andy? I'm busy." "I wanted to show you something," I grinned. "What?" he asked with some impatience. I waited for Crash to come bouncing out, but I heard nothing. I waited for a moment. Still nothing. "Well?" He tapped his foot. "I just thought you might want to see something," I stammered, turning to look over my shoulder. How long did he expect me to stall? "Yes, I would like to see something. I'd like to see you either in there helping me or up on the bridge helping Captain Trent like he asked you to." I turned back. "But I really need to show you something." "Well, then show me." The irritation in his voice was growing. I turned back to look over my shoulder again, hoping desperately that Crash would show himself. "Well..." "Why do you keep turning your head like that? Is someone back there?" Moving past me, he peered around the corner. "Have you gone crazy?" I watched him, puzzled. "No, I just..." As he turned back to face me, I saw surprise light up his eyes, then a second of disbelief followed by another of gladness, and then he managed to compose himself into a half-affectionate, half-stern expression resembling a smile. I didn't need to ask who was behind me, although how he had gotten there I had no idea at first. After thinking it over for a moment, I realized Crash had ducked into the sanitation room from the hall and then walked through into sickbay, coming out behind me. "Well, Mr. Crash?" He advanced and shook the young man's hand. Crash winked at me and laughed, and I felt that he was somehow both laughing with me and laughing at me. "How is it that no one mentioned that you were here?" "The how of it is, Uncle, that I asked them not to. I wanted to surprise you. You were surprised, weren't you?" "You scoundrel, you know I was. Why I allow myself to be taken in by all your schemes is beyond me, I'll tell you that much." I grabbed the doctor's arm. "Isn't it good to see Crash again, Doctor?" He looked at Crash's handsome, friendly, and slightly impish face and had to say, "Yes, I suppose it is." But in an instant his tone changed and he grunted. "What business had you to stay away for so long?" Crash sobered down. "It's not why I stayed away that's important right now. It's why I came back when I did." His tone was unusually serious, and the doctor looked more concerned than I felt. He peered at Crash. "What in blazes are you talking about?" "Did you hear about Dr. Holmes?" I watched as the doctor's face registered curiosity mingled with worry.
I haven't heard from him in months. Is something wrong?
Crash hesitated for a moment, then spoke solemnly.
He died last month.